Rain hammered the windows like 1,000 impatient fists. The storm outside had turned the city into a blur of smeared lights and trembling shadows. And inside his cramped apartment, Ethan sat bolt upright on the couch, heart racing. There was someone in his living room, not a burglar, not some shadow lurking with malice, but a woman. She was curled up on the far end of the couch, half asleep, shivering in a thin jacket that was far too light for weather like this. Her wet hair clung to her face, and every so often she muttered something under her breath, the words tangled in fevered dreams. Ethan hadn't planned this. In fact, 10 minutes earlier, he hadn't even known she existed. But now here she was, a stranger, dripping rainwater onto his threadbare cushions, the smell of storm and perfume clinging to the room. He paced once, twice, trying to process the absurdity of what had just happened. He'd been coming back from the late shift, hood pulled tight, when he saw her. She was sitting on the steps outside the convenience store, arms wrapped around her knees, looking like a ghost no one else could see. Most people walked by. A few stared and turned away. Ethan, against every rational instinct, had stopped. "Hey, are you okay?" he'd asked, words carried away by the wind. Her answer had been little more than a whisper, broken by the storm. He couldn't even remember what she'd said, only the trembling in her voice, the way her eyes had darted past him like she was running from something. And now she was in his home. Ethan ran a hand over his face. This was insane. Who just lets a stranger inside? Who invites someone with no explanation, no backstory, no proof of who they are, onto their couch in the middle of the night? He glanced at her again. She shifted, pulling the jacket tighter, lips moving soundlessly. Her face, pale and delicate under the harsh yellow glow of his lamp, carried a kind of worn-out beauty, like a painting left too long in the rain. Something in him softened. It wasn't pity. It was closer to recognition, like he knew that kind of exhaustion, that kind of weight pressing down until you couldn't stand anymore. The thunder outside cracked. The lights flickered once, then steadied. Ethan lowered himself into the armchair across from her, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. The steady drip of water from her shoes tapped against his cheap carpet. A rhythm, steady, inescapable. His phone buzzed on the table. A message from his landlord, rent due tomorrow. He locked the screen without answering, as if his life wasn't already complicated enough. For a long time, neither of them moved. The only sounds were the storm and her uneven breathing. Then, suddenly her eyes opened, dark, glassy, and startlingly alert. She sat up halfway, scanning the room, and for a second Ethan thought she might bolt. "You're safe," he said quickly, lifting his hands as if to prove he meant no harm. His voice sounded strange to him, gentler than he expected. Her gaze settled on him, sharp but hesitant. She swallowed. Her lips parted as though she wanted to explain herself, but the words seemed stuck. Finally, in a voice raw from cold, she managed, "Thank you." Two small words, but the way she said them, like she wasn't used to saying them at all, settled into the air with a weight that surprised him. Ethan nodded, unsure how to respond. "Do you need anything? Tea? A blanket?" She hesitated. "Just a minute." Her hand pressed against her forehead, fingers trembling slightly. She leaned back against the couch cushions, closing her eyes again. And in that moment, Ethan noticed something he hadn't before. Her clothes, though wrinkled from rain, weren't cheap. Not flashy designer stuff, but well-tailored, the kind of fabric that didn't belong on someone sitting outside a convenience store. Even her boots, mud-stained as they were expensive. The kind of expensive he could never dream of affording. It didn't make sense. Who was she? Why had she been alone, in the storm, looking like she had nothing left but the clothes on her back? Ethan leaned back, the questions gnawing at him, but he didn't ask them. Not yet. Because right then, as thunder rolled and her breathing steadied into a fragile rhythm, he realized something else. He had no idea what kind of storm he'd just let into his life, and neither of them knew that beneath the rain-soaked jacket, beneath the exhaustion, this stranger on his couch wasn't just anyone, she was an heiress. The storm had not started when she left the house. In fact, the evening had been eerily calm, skies stretched in a bruised shade of grey, air heavy with the kind of silence that presses against the skin. Her name was Clara Whitmore. She had not spoken it aloud in hours. It still felt strange, almost unreal, to abandon the weight of it. That name was a crown and a chain both. Whitmore, the kind that unlocked doors at marble-laced hotels, that drew stares at fundraisers, that carried whispers of power in boardrooms she never entered but always lived under. Yet tonight, she had shed it like a coat too heavy to bear. She had walked out of the Whitmore estate, past the iron gates that seemed taller than the sky, past the bodyguards stationed discreetly along the hedges, past the walls lined with imported marble statues, and kept walking. No driver, no car waiting, no phone. Her steps carried her farther than she thought they could, down into streets she'd only glimpsed through tinted glass. The further she walked, the smaller her world became, until she was just another girl moving through a city that didn't know her name. For hours, she moved without direction, as though motion itself could drown out the noise inside her head. The words, the shouting, her father's voice, thunderous across the dining hall, "You will not embarrass this family." It had been over something small, at least to her, a choice she wanted to make for herself. A life she wanted that didn't align with the empire her last name demanded she inherit. Clara had stood her ground, voice shaking but clear. "I don't want to be your pawn anymore." And with that, silence, the kind that cuts sharper than any insult. Her father's face had hardened into stone. The room, filled with gleaming chandeliers and priceless art, had felt like a prison cell. So she left. By the time the storm broke, Clara was already deep into the city. The rain hit fast and hard, soaking her silk blouse, weighing her hair down until it clung like seaweed. She ducked under awnings, wandered into alleys, but it didn't matter. The storm followed. Her boots clicked against the wet pavement, and for the first time in her life, she realized she had nowhere to go, no one she could call. The people she knew weren't friends. They were orbiters, drawn to her wealth, her name, not her. Strip that away and what was left? So she sat on the steps of the convenience store, rain sliding down her face, mascara bleeding into black streaks, arms wrapped around herself, trying to look invisible, though the truth was she had never been more exposed. And then a voice. "Hey, are you okay?" At first she hadn't looked up. She thought it was another stranger passing by, throwing half-hearted concern without slowing their pace. But the voice lingered, low, steady. When she raised her head, she saw him. The man in the hood, eyes wary but kind, posture careful like someone balancing suspicion and compassion at once. For a second, she almost laughed. What a ridiculous thing this was. Clara Whitmore, heiress to a fortune, sitting drenched on a sidewalk, staring at a man she had never seen before. She wanted to tell him to leave her alone, to turn the words sharp, so he wouldn't stay long enough to ask questions she couldn't answer. But when she opened her mouth, all that came out was a broken murmur, and something in his face changed. He didn't leave. He didn't look at her with the usual cocktail of awe and greed she was used to when people realized who she was. He didn't know. He just saw someone who needed help. The thought unsettled her more than the storm. He offered his hand. She almost refused, almost told him to go back to his warm apartment and leave her to her choices. But her fingers, stiff from the cold, reached out before her pride could stop them. And just like that, she was on her feet, following him. Now as she lay against his couch, the smell of cheap detergent in the fabric, the muted hum of the city rising outside his window, Clara felt a strange sense of stillness. She had run so far so fast from the prison of her family's mansion. Yet here, in the home of a man who owned almost nothing, she felt more like herself than she had in years. Still, the questions gnawed at her. Who was he? Why had he stopped when others kept walking? And why did it matter to her at all? Ethan, meanwhile, sat across the room, his gaze flicking between her and the rent notice on his phone. He wasn't a savior. He wasn't even sure he could afford kindness right now. But he also knew what it felt like to be overlooked, dismissed, left in the rain by a world that didn't care. And maybe, just maybe, that was why he had stopped. Neither of them knew it yet, but their lives had just collided in a way that would change them both. And as the storm outside deepened, Clara Whitmore, the girl who had everything, was about to learn what it meant to have nothing but the mercy of a stranger. Long before the storm, Ethan had learned what it meant to be invisible. He grew up in a house that sagged against the weight of silence. His father was gone before Ethan had turned 6, a name scribbled on the bottom of court papers and never spoken aloud again. His mother worked double shifts, waitressing by day, cleaning offices by night, and though she loved him fiercely, her exhaustion wrapped around her like armor. Ethan spent most of his boyhood alone at the kitchen table, cereal soggy in its bowl, alone on the school bus, face pressed against the fogged glass, alone in the hospital waiting room when his mother collapsed from exhaustion, and he sat clutching her purse until the doctor finally called his name. That kind of loneliness leaves a mark. Not the dramatic kind, not scars you can point to, but a quieter, sharper kind that shapes the way you move in the world. Ethan had become someone who noticed others like him, the overlooked, the forgotten. It explained why, years later, standing outside that convenience store with rain soaking through his hood, he didn't just keep walking, because once he had been that person, and nobody had stopped for him. The apartment he lived in now wasn't much. A single bedroom barely large enough for the bed, a living room that smelled faintly of the neighbors' cooking no matter how many candles he lit, and a kitchen where the fridge hummed louder than the TV. But it was his rent, his responsibility, his survival. He'd been working nights at a shipping warehouse, the kind of job that tore your back apart slowly, where the air smelled of cardboard and sweat, where the fluorescent lights made your eyes ache. Paychecks were steady but thin. Half went to rent. Another chunk went to overdue medical bills from his mother, who still lived 2 towns away and refused to move closer. Ethan had long since given up on the idea of saving. His life was a balancing act. One unexpected expense, and everything collapsed. That was the reality buzzing on his phone tonight, the landlord's reminder, the unspoken threat of eviction hanging like a noose. He should have walked past her. Logic screamed at him to keep his head down, to think of his own survival. But logic doesn't silence memory. When Ethan had been 17, he'd crashed on a friend's couch for 2 weeks after his mother lost her job. Those nights had branded themselves into him, the smell of someone else's laundry detergent on the pillow, the shame of needing a place, the constant fear of overstaying his welcome. That girl on his couch now, she had carried that same look in her eyes, the look of someone teetering on the edge of vanishing. And so Ethan had opened his door. Now, as the storm pressed harder against the window panes, he studied her more carefully. Her breathing had evened out, but it wasn't restful. Every so often her shoulders twitched, her lips forming half words. Nightmares, maybe. He wanted to ask, but he knew the rule. You don't push someone when they're hanging by threads. His gaze drifted again to her clothes. That jacket, it wasn't from any discount rack. The stitching was too clean, the material too smooth. Even soaked in rain, it carried a kind of unintentional elegance. Her boots, scuffed though they were, had probably cost more than his month's rent. The contradiction unsettled him. If she was wealthy, why was she here? If she had family, why was she alone in the storm? And if she was lying, what kind of trouble had he just invited into his home? Ethan leaned back in the armchair, dragging a hand through his damp hair. The flickering lamp made the shadows crawl along the walls, twisting everything into uneasy shapes. He thought of his mother again. Her voice, hoarse from long nights at work, always saying the same thing when he doubted himself. People don't forget kindness. Ethan, even when the world spits on you, kindness matters. It was a lesson carved into him, but kindness didn't pay rent. He let out a shaky laugh under his breath. "What the hell am I doing?" The woman stirred. Her eyes fluttered open for a second, locking on him across the room. Not long enough to speak. Just long enough to remind him that she was real, not some storm-born phantom. And in her gaze, just for that heartbeat, he saw something raw. Not anger, not fear. Something closer to desperation. Then her eyes closed again. Ethan sat frozen, heart pounding louder than the rain. Whoever she was, whatever world she'd come from, he knew it wasn't a world like his, and he couldn't shake the feeling that bringing her inside had set something in motion, something that wouldn't stop, even if he wanted it to. Outside, thunder rolled like a warning. Morning came reluctantly. The storm had broken in the night, leaving the city washed raw and pale. From Ethan's window, the skyline looked like it had been scrubbed with cold water, every building dripping, every street glistening. The air smelled faintly metallic, the kind of clean that only follows a downpour. Inside the apartment, silence held. Ethan sat on the edge of his armchair, groggy, his back aching from half-sleep. He'd stayed awake longer than he meant to, watching the stranger on his couch as though she might vanish if he blinked. But she hadn't. She was still there. Her breathing had steadied in the night, her body curled under the blanket he'd finally draped over her. Now, in the pale light, she looked younger than she had beneath the lamp's shadow, though younger wasn't the right word. More vulnerable. The delicate lines around her eyes and mouth seemed softer, less guarded, as though exhaustion had stripped her of armor. Ethan rose quietly, stretching stiff limbs. He moved into the kitchen, set a kettle on the stove, and opened his cabinet. Choices were grim: stale bread, 2 packets of instant noodles, half a jar of peanut butter. He grimaced. Hospitality wasn't his strong suit. The kettle began its slow whistle, just as movement stirred behind him. He turned. She was sitting up now, the blanket pooled around her waist. Her hair hung loose, a tangled halo of dark strands, and her eyes, sharp, unflinching even through fatigue, locked on him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she cleared her throat, voice hoarse but steady. "You stayed up," Ethan shrugged. "Didn't trust you not to rob me blind," her mouth twitched. Almost a smile, almost. "You've got nothing worth stealing?" "Exactly," he said, pouring hot water into 2 chipped mugs. Steam curled into the air, carrying the faint scent of cheap black tea. That's what makes it precious. She studied him, head tilted slightly, as though she hadn't expected the bite in his humor. When he crossed the room and handed her the mug, she took it with both hands. Her fingers trembled slightly against the ceramic, but she didn't comment. Instead, she blew gently on the steam, eyes falling into the cup as though it held answers she hadn't found elsewhere. Ethan sat across from her again, elbows on his knees. "So you're going to tell me your name?" A pause, then, "Clara, no last name." "No details." "Just a first name, set down between them like a token." "Clara," he repeated, as if testing its weight. "All right. I'm Ethan," she nodded faintly, taking a sip. The tea was weak, but warmth spread across her expression like she hadn't tasted something so simple in years. They sat in silence again, cups warming their hands. Finally, Ethan leaned back. "So, Clara, you planning on telling me why you were camped outside a convenience store in the middle of a storm? Or is that one of those mysteries I'm supposed to live with?" Her eyes flickered, just for a second. Hesitation. "I just needed to get away," she said softly. "From what?" Her gaze lifted to him then, steady, unblinking. "From everything." Ethan almost laughed, but the look in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't drama. It wasn't exaggeration. It was something heavier, something that pressed against her like invisible weight. He nodded slowly, as if accepting that answer for now. He didn't press further. Clara set her mug down on the table, fingers lingering on the chipped rim. She glanced around the apartment, the faded curtains, the stack of unopened mail, the worn rug under their feet. A different world than hers. She wondered if he knew how much safer it felt than the mansion she'd fled. "You live alone?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, unless you count the occasional mouse in the wall." "Rent's too high for roommates." Something in his voice betrayed the strain of that rent. Clara caught it, though she didn't comment. Instead, she asked, "Why did you stop?" "Last night." "You didn't know me. You had no reason to?" Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Because nobody ever did that for me. Figured I'd break the chain." Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. That answer sat heavier than the silence that followed. The clock on the wall ticked, each second loud in the cramped room. Outside, the city was stirring, horns honking, voices rising, buses groaning down slick streets. Clara sipped her tea again, though it had gone cold. She knew she couldn't stay. She knew someone, somewhere, would already be looking for her. The Whitmore name didn't vanish quietly, but she wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. Not when this stranger, this Ethan, had given her a couch and a blanket and the kind of kindness money could never buy. She studied him again, the tired lines on his face, the calluses on his hands. He didn't know her. He didn't know the world she'd come from, the storm she'd brought with her. And maybe that was the danger. Because once he did, everything would change. At the Whitmore estate, the storm had not merely passed, it had deepened. Rain sluiced down the marble steps, poured off the edges of the slate roof, and turned the long drive into a glistening river of black asphalt. The mansion loomed against the grey sky like a fortress, iron gates shut tight, security lights casting pale halos into the mist. Inside, the air was colder than the storm outside. Find her. The command cracked like a whip across the dining hall. Gerald Whitmore stood at the head of the table, his fists pressed into the polished mahogany, his face hard as granite. He was a man built from authority, his posture sharpened by decades of wealth and control. When he spoke, entire boardrooms shifted. Tonight, his voice carried the weight of a father's fury disguised as discipline. Two men in dark suits, security chiefs, both exchanged uneasy glances. One cleared his throat. "Sir, we've already dispatched drivers to the city. We've contacted her usual places, the club, the hotels she favours." "No sign! Then widen the circle," Gerald snapped. "Call the police commissioner. Tell him my daughter has gone missing and that if he wants his funding intact, he'll make this his top priority." The men bowed their heads slightly and slipped from the room. Silence followed. Except it wasn't silence. Not really. The storm rattled the tall windows. Wind whistled down the hallways, and beneath it all, Gerald could hear the echo of Clara's words from the night before. "I don't want to be your pawn anymore." He closed his eyes briefly, rage tightening his jaw. Pawn. The word stung because it was true, though he would never admit it. Clara wasn't just his daughter, she was the future of Whitmore Industries, the carefully groomed heir to a dynasty worth billions. She had been raised for this role, trained in etiquette, in finance, in poise. He had shaped her, molded her, sacrificed for her. And now she had walked out. The thought made his chest tighten, though whether it was anger or fear he couldn't decide. "Sir." The voice pulled him back. His sister Evelyn stepped into the room. Tall, severe, with eyes like cut glass, she carried herself with the same Whitmore steel. She's not at the penthouse. Her cards haven't been used. If she's gone into the city, she's cut herself off deliberately. Gerald's eyes narrowed.
"She wouldn't last an hour out there." Evelyn crossed her arms. "Don't underestimate her."
"She's stubborn. She gets that from you." A muscle jumped in his cheek. He turned away, pacing to the window, watching the rain smear the view of the grounds. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, uncertainty. What if she doesn't want to be found? Evelyn asked quietly. The question hung in the air, sharp as glass. Gerald spun, his voice low. "Dangerous."
"She is my daughter. She will be found."
"She will return."
End of discussion. But it wasn't the end, because across the city,
Clara was curled on a stranger's couch, sipping cheap tea, breathing in the scent of a life untouched by wealth. And the Whitmores were tightening their net. In a private office elsewhere on the estate, rows of monitors flickered with live feeds from cameras positioned across the city, traffic lights, building entrances, shopping districts. Whitmore money had long since ensured access to things most citizens never knew existed. "Run the footage again," one of the security men ordered, his voice taut. "Search for her face. 6-hour window. Anything," the software churned, thousands of frames flashing. Grainy images of people in raincoats, umbrellas, blurred outlines beneath neon signs.
"Then stop." The footage froze.
A young woman, hair plastered to her face, sitting on the steps of a convenience store. The angle was poor, the rain distorting the image, but it was enough. Clara. The guard leaned closer. Relief surged, followed by confusion. Another figure entered the frame.
A man in a hood, pausing, speaking to her.
Then helping her to her feet. Together they vanished into the storm. The guard frowned. "Who the hell is he?" Back in the dining hall, Gerald stood with a glass of scotch in his hand. Though he hadn't tasted it, he stared into the amber liquid as Evelyn re-entered, holding a tablet. "We found her on city cams," she said, an hour before the storm peaked. She wasn't alone, his head lifted sharply.
"Who?" Evelyn tapped the screen.
A still image appeared, the grainy shot of Clara and the man in the hood. Gerald studied it, jaw tightening. The man's face wasn't clear, but his posture, his presence beside her, it was enough. "Find him," Gerald said coldly. "If he's hiding her, I want his name, his address, everything."
"Anyone who thinks they can take what's mine will learn otherwise." Evelyn hesitated.
She didn't look taken, Gerald. She looked
like she chose to go with him. He set the glass down with a sharp crack against the table. "I don't care how it looked."
"Bring her home." No matter the cost, thunder rolled again outside, distant but heavy, and across the city, in a worn-down apartment. Ethan glanced at Clara as she shifted under the blanket, unaware that a storm far more dangerous than the one outside was already closing in. The morning light had sharpened, turning the edges of the apartment clear and unforgiving. Dust motes drifted through the slant of sun across the floor, and the faint hum of the city carried through the thin windows, honking horns, snippets of conversations, the metallic whine of a train in the distance. Ethan rinsed the 2 mugs in the sink, trying not to glance too often toward the couch, but he couldn't help it. Clara sat there, blanket folded neatly across her lap, posture straighter now, as though sleep had returned some of her composure. If last night she'd seemed fragile, this morning she seemed contained, a quiet shift, but one Ethan noticed. "You don't have to do that," Clara said softly, nodding toward the sink. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag. "You drink it, I wash it." House rule. She almost smiled. Almost. Fair enough. For a moment, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was tentative. A space that could hold something more if either dared to reach. But Ethan was cautious. Years of scraping by had taught him not to trust quiet moments. They never lasted. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "So, Clara, you going to tell me where you're headed? Or are you planning on making my couch your new permanent address?" Her eyes flicked to him, unreadable.
"Do you want me gone?"
The question caught him off guard, not because of the words, but because of how she asked them, steady, without fear, as though she was bracing for a truth she already expected. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, it's not about wanting you gone. It's just, I'm not exactly running a shelter here. I've got bills, rent, life breathing down my neck. If someone else found you instead of me, someone less patient, you might not have woken up safe." Her gaze dropped to her hands, fingers tightening around the blanket. "I know," Ethan frowned. He wanted to ask, then why risk it? Why were you out there alone? But the words stuck. He had the sense that pushing would break something fragile between them. Instead, he said, "I don't regret it, though."
"Letting you in," her head lifted at that.
Her eyes softened just enough for him to see the weariness underneath. "Not many people would have stopped," she said quietly. "Yeah, well," Ethan muttered, "not many people know what it's like." She studied him a long moment, as though she wanted to ask what he meant, but she didn't, not yet. The apartment felt smaller as the hours stretched. Clara wandered to the window, peering down at the street below. She watched the flow of strangers, umbrellas bobbing, taxis honking, vendors shouting over carts of food, a world moving forward without her name trailing behind. From this height, she wasn't Clara Whitmore, heir to an empire. She was just Clara, anonymous, invisible. And for the first time in years, that anonymity felt like freedom. Ethan joined her at the window, leaning against the wall. "Not the prettiest view, I know." She shook her head. "It's
"Real." The word lingered. Ethan turned his gaze to her, curious.
But her expression had gone distant, as though she was somewhere else entirely. "Clara," he said after a pause, "whatever it is you're running from—"
"It's not going to stay away forever," her breath caught.
For a second he thought she might tell him, spill whatever story had dragged her from a mansion staircase to his threadbare couch. But instead, she just said, "I know," and that was it, across the city. Unseen by either of them, Whitmore security teams were fanning out through neighborhoods, combing footage, pulling strings with local precincts.
A face in a grainy frame was enough to begin a hunt, and Ethan, unaware of the noose tightening, stood only a few feet from Clara.
Wondering why every instinct screamed that his life had just been set on a path he couldn't undo. Later that afternoon, Clara insisted on helping. She folded the blanket, tidied the couch cushions, even tried to wash the mugs again, though Ethan waved her off. "You don't have to play house guest," he said. "I'm not," she replied simply.
"I'm trying not to feel useless." There was something raw in the way she said it.
Ethan didn't argue. Instead, he offered her the last packet of instant noodles. They ate side by side on the couch, steam rising from mismatched bowls, the taste salty and thin but grounding. Clara slurped a noodle, then smirked faintly. "This is terrible." "Best $5 for $1 meal you'll ever find," Ethan said. Her smirk widened, just slightly. And for the first time since she'd stepped into his life, Ethan saw a glimpse of who she might be without the storm around her. Someone who laughed.
Someone young.
Someone alive. The glimpse was fleeting. Her phone, silent until now, buzzed faintly in her jacket pocket. Clara froze. Ethan looked at her. "You've got a phone?" She hesitated. "It's
Not important." But the flicker of fear in her eyes told a different story. Ethan leaned back, unsettled.
Whoever was on the other end of that phone wasn't just a missed call. It was a tether, a reminder of the world she'd run from, and Clara knew it too. The day slipped toward evening, shadows stretching long across Ethan's floor. The hum of the radiator, the city's muffled pulse outside, everything seemed quieter, as though the world itself held its breath. Clara sat on the couch, legs tucked beneath her, reading one of the worn paperbacks Ethan had stacked against the wall. The book looked out of place in her hands, as though it had been plucked from another life and deposited here, its spine cracked, its pages yellowed. Yet she read it with a kind of hunger, eyes tracing the lines like someone starved for words that weren't contracts, statements, or carefully managed letters. Ethan watched her from the kitchen table. He didn't mean to. He told himself he was tinkering with his old laptop, trying to get the Wi-Fi to hold steady, but his gaze kept straying. She was too composed now, too silent.
Almost like she was trying to disappear into the book. He finally broke the stillness. You always read like that?
She glanced up, puzzled. Like what? Like it's the last story you'll ever get to hear. Her lips curved faintly. Maybe it is, Ethan frowned. That's not funny. Clara lowered her eyes back to the page, but her fingers trembled slightly as she turned it. Across the city, black sedans moved through streets that grew narrower, rougher. Whitmore security men, suits cut sharp, eyes sharper, flashed badges, showed grainy stills pulled from traffic cameras. Seen this woman? They asked the corner bodega owner, the bus driver, the janitor sweeping outside the laundromat. Some shook their heads. Others lingered too long on the photo, recognizing the features even if they didn't dare admit it. An heiress missing, a fortune behind her name, it was enough to make tongues heavy. The search crept closer. Block by block, and Ethan's apartment sat only a handful of streets away. Inside, Ethan tried again. So where'd you learn to vanish like that?
Into a book, I mean. Clara looked at him, her expression unreadable.
Then slowly, I used to hide in libraries when I was younger. Why? Because the halls of my house echoed.
Too big, too quiet.
In the library, I could sit between the shelves and pretend I belonged to a different story. Her voice caught on that last word. She quickly closed the book. Ethan studied her, piecing together fragments he didn't fully understand.
A house too big.
A silence too heavy. It wasn't the life of someone scraping rent together. That much was clear. But whatever it was, she wasn't ready to lay it bare. He leaned back in his chair. Guess that explains why you made it halfway through of Mice and Men in one sitting. She gave him the smallest smile. Better than staring at the ceiling. The ceiling above them, cracked and water-stained, groaned faintly as the upstairs neighbor dragged something heavy across the floor. Life went on around them, anonymous and indifferent, and for a brief moment it felt like they were safe inside this little pocket of stillness. Until a knock rattled the door. Clara stiffened, eyes wide.
Ethan froze. The knock came again, firm, deliberate. Ethan rose slowly, crossing the room.
His hand hovered over the knob, but instinct made him stop short. He leaned close to the peephole instead. A man in a black coat stood in the hallway.
Not a neighbor, not delivery.
He wasn't looking at the door. He was speaking into a phone, his voice low, clipped. Ethan's gut tightened. He stepped back, careful to keep his movements quiet. Clara was watching him, her face pale. "Who is it?" she whispered. Ethan shook his head.
Not anyone I know. The knock came a third time, louder now.
Then silence. A moment later, the man's footsteps faded down the hall. But the unease stayed behind, thick in the air. Clara gripped the edge of the couch cushion, her knuckles white. "They're looking for me," she whispered. The words fell between them like a stone. Ethan stared at her.
Clara, who are you?
She opened her mouth, closed it again.
A war raged behind her eyes, the urge to tell the truth clashing with the instinct to protect it. Finally,
she whispered, "Not who you think." And that was all she gave him. Later, Long after the footsteps in the hall had vanished, Ethan sat awake in the dark. Clara had drifted into a restless sleep, her breathing uneven, the blanket drawn up to her chin. He couldn't shake the image of the man outside the door, the tailored coat, the sharpness in his posture. Whoever Clara was hiding from, they weren't random strangers. They had reach. They had resources, and Ethan, who'd thought he was just giving a stranger shelter for a night, was now caught in something far bigger than he understood. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint rumble of traffic, and wondered what storm he'd let in when he opened his door. The night had turned heavy. The radiator clicked, sputtering heat in uneven bursts. Outside, sirens wailed faintly, swallowed by the city's restless pulse. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring at the same unopened beer he'd pulled from the fridge an hour ago. Across the room, Clara stirred beneath the blanket. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dim light. She watched him for a moment before speaking. "You're not sleeping?" Ethan looked up. Shadows cut sharp across his face.
Couldn't. Clara sat up, pulling the blanket tighter.
Because of the man at the door? Ethan's jaw clenched. You tell me. The silence stretched. Clara's lips parted, closed, then parted again. Finally, she rose from the couch, walked toward the table, and sat opposite him. Her movements were graceful, but there was a tremor in her hands that betrayed her calm. "You deserve to know," she whispered. Ethan leaned forward, waiting. "My last name isn't what I told you." She paused.
"It's Whitmore!" The word landed like a stone in water, rippling outward. Ethan blinked.
The name tugged at something familiar. Headlines he'd skimmed, magazine covers in checkout lines, whispers about wealth and scandal. The Whitmores weren't just wealthy, they were untouchable. He let out a low breath. "Whitmore?"
As in, yes, Clara cut in, almost too quickly.
"That Whitmore." Ethan pushed the beer aside, suddenly nauseous.
"So what the hell are you doing on my couch? Shouldn't you be, I don't know,
Behind gates? Surrounded by guards?
living in some palace?"
Clara's laugh was hollow. "You'd think so." "Then explain," Ethan pressed. His voice was low, sharp.
"Why were you out there?"
"Why risk ending up in the gutter when you've got—"
"Everything?"
Clara's gaze dropped to the table. Her voice softened, edged with bitterness.
"Because everything isn't freedom."
"Not when every move is planned, every word weighed, every smile rehearsed."
"I felt like a ghost in my own house." Ethan stared at her, struggling to piece it together.
"So you ran." "I didn't plan it," she admitted.
"I just walked out."
One night, after another endless dinner with people who spoke about me like I wasn't even there, I walked until the city swallowed me.
"And then I couldn't turn back." Her hands twisted together in her lap. "They'll say I'm reckless, ungrateful, maybe even unstable.
But the truth?
I just wanted to know what it felt like to live without being owned." The words hung between them, raw and trembling. Ethan leaned back, running a hand over his face.
He wanted to be angry at her for not telling him sooner, at himself for letting her inside without asking questions. But beneath the anger was something else, something dangerously close to recognition, because hadn't he spent his whole life trying to claw free of chains? Not golden ones, but chains of poverty, of circumstance, of debts that strangled him before he could breathe. Different worlds, same cage. He exhaled slowly. "You know this means trouble, right? Whoever's out there knocking, those guys don't just stop. They'll keep hunting until they drag you back." Clara's eyes lifted to his, shimmering in the dim light.
"I know, then why tell me?"
"Because you let me in," she whispered.
"And for once, I wanted someone to see me, just me, not Whitmore." Her voice cracked on the name. For a long moment, Ethan didn't move.
Didn't speak. The weight of her truth pressed down on him, reshaping the ground beneath his feet. Finally, he stood, pacing the narrow length of the kitchen. His heart pounded with a rhythm he couldn't slow. "Clara, if they find you here, it's not just you they'll drag away. It's me too."
"I don't exactly have the kind of life that survives a spotlight." She flinched.
"I don't want to ruin yours."
"Then what's the plan?"
He demanded. "You going to stay here forever?"
Hide under a blanket until your family gives up.
Her silence answered for her. Ethan swore under his breath. Outside, another car rolled slowly down the block, headlights sweeping across cracked pavement. A man in the passenger seat studied a tablet, the glow of Clara's face on the screen reflected in his eyes. They were close, too close, and inside, Clara and Ethan sat in the fragile stillness of a truth finally spoken, knowing it had only made the storm outside more dangerous. The knock came just after midnight, not a polite tap, not the hesitant rap of a neighbor. It was a heavy, deliberate pounding, 3 strikes that rattled the thin wood of Ethan's door. Ethan's eyes shot open. He dozed in the armchair, boots still on, body tense even in sleep. Clara stirred on the couch, disoriented. The pounding came again. "Ethan," she whispered, voice tight with fear. He raised a hand, silencing her. His heart hammered against his ribs. The 3rd round of knocks thundered through the apartment. Whoever stood out there wasn't going away. Ethan crept toward the door, barefoot now, his steps careful on the creaking floorboards. He pressed his eye to the peephole. 2 men, suits tailored, shoulders broad. Their faces carried the hard stillness of men used to command. One held a phone to his ear, murmuring. The other scanned the hallway with predator's patience. Ethan's gut turned to stone.
These weren't cops.
They weren't landlords or neighbors. They were Whitmore men. He stepped back, pulse pounding. Clara was on her feet now, blanket pooled at her ankles.
"It's them, isn't it?" She breathed. Ethan didn't answer.
He didn't have to. The men outside spoke, muffled through the door, but the words still carried. "Miss Whitmore, we know you're inside. This is your last chance to come quietly." Clara's face drained of color. Ethan's eyes snapped to her.
"They know." She shook her head, trembling. I don't know how. I never called. The man's voice boomed again, sharper.
"We have to force entry. It won't be pleasant."
"Open the door!" Ethan's mind raced.
He had no weapon, no plan. Just a flimsy lock and 4 floors of crumbling stairs between them and freedom. He hissed under his breath. "Do they have the right to break in?" Clara's voice shook. "If they brought police, yes. But if it's just them—" She faltered, eyes wide with realization. "They don't want the police. They want me under their control before the story gets out." Another pounding strike rattled the doorframe. The lock quivered, straining. Clara grabbed Ethan's sleeve. "We have to run." He almost laughed at the madness of it.
Run? From men who could buy the whole block?
But one look at her face, terrified, fragile, determined, and something inside him hardened. "Fire escape," he muttered. They crossed the apartment quickly, trying to stay quiet, but the doorframe groaned as another blow landed. Wood splintered. Clara's breath came fast, ragged. Ethan shoved open the window, the hinges screeching. Cold air slapped their faces. The fire escape groaned beneath their weight as they climbed out, metal rattling under hurried steps. Below them, the city sprawled in restless lights. Above them, the apartment door finally gave way with a crack that echoed down the block. "Go, Clara!" Ethan urged. She scrambled down the ladder, her hands gripping cold iron. Ethan followed, glancing back just once. 2 men stormed inside his apartment, their shouts sharp, furious. "Move!" one barked. The fire escape shuddered as Clara hit the pavement, stumbling onto the cracked alley floor. Ethan dropped beside her, steadying her with a hand. They bolted into the shadows, sneakers slapping asphalt, lungs burning. Behind them, voices roared. "There, down the alley." Flashlights cut through the dark, beams slicing across graffiti-stained walls. Ethan yanked Clara into a side passage, narrow and reeking of damp brick and trash. They pressed against the wall, barely breathing. The light swept past, missed them by inches, and kept going. For a moment, all Ethan could hear was Clara's heartbeat against his chest, frantic and wild. Her whisper was barely a breath. "They won't stop." Ethan swallowed hard.
eyes scanning the dark.
He knew she was right. These weren't men who gave up. They were men who finished the job. And now, whether he wanted it or not, Ethan was tangled in her war. He tightened his grip on her hand. And we don't stop either. Back in the apartment, one of the Whitmore men surveyed the overturned couch, the open window, the chaos of departure. He lifted his phone to his ear. We lost them. A pause. The man's jaw tightened.
Yes, sir, but they're close.
Very close. He ended the call, his gaze sharp as a blade. They can't run forever. They ran until the city blurred, past shuttered storefronts, neon signs flickering, streets alive with the scent of fried food and exhaust. Clara's breath tore through her chest, each inhale sharp, but she didn't stop. Ethan's hand never left hers, pulling her through the maze of alleys and side streets like he'd lived them his whole life. Finally, they ducked into an abandoned subway entrance, the iron gate half ajar, rust flaking beneath their grip. Inside, the tunnels yawned dark and damp, graffiti scrawled across tile walls. Their footsteps echoed in the cavernous silence until they collapsed onto a cold concrete ledge. Clara pressed her palms to her knees, gasping. Ethan bent double, hands on his thighs, sweat running down his temples. For a long moment neither spoke. The city roared above, distant and indifferent, as if unaware of the small war waged below its streets. At last, Clara's voice trembled through the stillness. They'll never stop.
Ethan, not until I'm dragged back. Ethan lifted his head, his chest still heaving.
Then don't let them. Choose something else. Her laugh was a broken sound.
You think it's that simple?
You don't understand what it means to be a Whitmore. My face is printed on magazines I never agreed to. My signature tied to businesses I didn't build.
My father, he doesn't lose. Not people. Not anything. Ethan stepped closer, his voice rough but steady. Clara, I don't care about the name.
I care about the person who read of mice and men like it was air. The person who smiled at cheap noodles. The person who said thank you when I offered her a couch, even though she could have looked at me like dirt. That's who I see.
Not Whitmore. Her eyes shimmered in the dim light, the weight of his words settling into her chest.
For a moment, the subway didn't feel like a hideout. It felt like the first place she could breathe. But the sound of footsteps shattered it. Heavy, measured, descending the stairwell. Flashlights cut through the darkness, beams slicing across tiled walls. Clara's body went rigid.
Ethan grabbed her hand again, pulling her deeper into the tunnel.
The air grew colder, damper, the ground slick with age-old water. Their footsteps splashed softly, trying to stay ahead of the beams closing in. At a bend, Ethan stopped, chest heaving. He pressed her against the wall, shielding her from sight. The lights passed within feet of them, voices echoing, low, commanding, relentless, spread out. She's here. When the sound receded, Clara pressed her forehead to Ethan's chest, her whisper fractured.
I can't keep running.
Not forever. Ethan looked down at her, jaw tight. He wanted to say yes, you can. Wanted to promise safety, to drag her into some unknown tomorrow where the Whitmores couldn't reach. But the truth sat heavy on his tongue. She was right.
They could outrun men for a night. Not an empire. Then you decide, he said quietly.
Do you go back, or do you fight to stay gone? Her breath hitched.
And you? I'm already in it, he said.
Wherever you go. The silence between them stretched, heavy with the weight of choice. Clara lifted her face. In the dim flicker of a broken fluorescent overhead, she looked both terrified and alive. I can't go back, she whispered.
Not to a cage. Not to being their perfect heiress. The decision cracked something open inside her.
Fear, yes, but also fire. Ethan's hand tightened around hers. Then we keep moving.
Until you're not Clara Whitmore anymore. Until you're just Clara. Her lips trembled into a fragile smile. By dawn, the city had shifted again.
The search cars had thinned, the streets washed in pale grey light. Somewhere, the Whitmores gathered around polished tables, furious at their failure. Somewhere, Men in suits cursed their long night of chasing shadows. And in a forgotten corner of the city, two figures slipped into the morning, tired, hollowed, but unbroken. Clara paused on the cracked sidewalk, watching the sunrise gild the skyline. Her chest tightened with something she hadn't felt in years. Hope, fragile and dangerous, Ethan stood beside her, silent. The world ahead of them was uncertain, maybe even impossible, but it was theirs. Clara whispered, almost to herself. I let the cage open.
I can't step back inside. Ethan glanced at her, the corner of his mouth lifting.
Then don't. They walked on into a city that didn't know their names. And for the first time since the night she stepped onto Ethan's doorstep, Clara felt the weight of her family's name begin to slip from her shoulders. The heiress was gone. What remained was a woman choosing, at last, to be free.